the he said, she said stories about telling both sides. I mean, the old adage is that if you're a reporter and you're interviewing two people and it's pouring rain outside and you ask one guy, hey, what's the weather out? And the first guy says, hey, it's raining. But you ask the second guy and he says, well, it's sunny out. You know, what is a reporter? Are they to report, well, one guy says it's raining, the other guy says it's sunny, or is it your responsibility to walk outside and say, you know what, it's raining?
Yeah.
And we're kind of at that point now as to how to, who's the truth teller and who do we believe?
Welcome to Being Understood, a podcast where we explore what it means to be understood in the world today and talk to communicators who help organizations do that. Welcome to my co-host, Bess.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Bess. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. Joining us today is our President and COO, John Blackshaw. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you have quite an interesting story, an interesting background. Tell us how you got to where you are today.
I do. I've kind of taken a very interesting path. I did most of my growing up in California, and that's where I sort of graduated from high school and went to college out there and law school. And when I was in college, I graduated as a political science major, and I always knew I wanted to go to law school. And so before I went to law school, after I graduated from college, I graduated with a political science degree, and I went to Washington, D.C., and I ended up working on Capitol Hill for first the Senate Banking Committee. I was just an intern with them, and then I moved over to on the personal staff of a United States Senator from New Jersey. And I did that for about 3 years, and I was just a lowly sort of legislative aide at that time. There's an interesting story behind that because I happened to work for a guy that was wrapped up in a political nightmare. He was indicted under a government investigation called Abscam. And actually, American Hustle, the movie, was kind of based loosely on that.
Wow. Is there a character based on you?
Yeah. The Bradley, he's me. And so then after I spent some time there, and I went to law school, and then after law school, I went to work for a law firm. But during that time, even when I was in high school, I always had a passion for politics. Yeah. And it started off on the electoral side of politics, and then eventually moved into the governance side of politics. But and so I, throughout the years, I have worked almost at every level of a political campaign, from door knocking to canvassing to eventually I ended up managing a few campaigns. One, I started sort of at the city council level, did some congressional races, did some state races, and then ended up at after a while, I ended up on a presidential campaign. I was a national advance man for candidate Mike Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts at the time. But I was continuing practicing law at that time, and I was a business litigator, and then I eventually moved into the corporate side of law. But again, my heart kind of was still back in politics. And one of the things I discovered, back up, I went to Washington, D.C. I ended up here in Minnesota because I was asked to manage the Senate campaign for Senator Paul Wellstone in 1990. And we won, there's a whole bunch of stuff about being understood that's really relevant to that campaign. But I'll jump back to that. We won that race, and I went to Washington, D.C. with Senator Wellstone. I was his chief of staff for several years. And I was kind of recruited back here to kind of go back into law. And I spent about a little over a year as a general counsel for the professional sports team, Minnesota North Stars, the hockey team here. And hockey team eventually left, went down to Dallas, and I was really kind of looking for my next gig. I didn't know if I wanted to really go back into the practice of law, even though I loved it. But I really was still very fascinated with politics, and I had just come out of governance side of politics. And so I started networking here in Minnesota. I actually thought a lot about going back to California, back to my law firm there. And I ran into some people. One of them, I remember talking with a guy that was the chief deputy in the Attorney General's office at the time. His name was Jack Tunheim, or John Tunheim. And he, I was talking to him about actually joining the Attorney General's office. And he said, you're kind of into the consulting thing. Why don't you talk to my wife, Kathy, who just started a firm with 4 or 5 other people. And she might be an interesting person to talk to if you're really interested in that consulting stuff. So I did. I went and talked to Kathy. One thing led to another, and I ended up here with, by the time I got here, I think I was like the 13th or 14th employee.
Oh, wow.
So it was going pretty good at the time. Mm-hmm. And what I came in to do was start the public affairs practice. And at that time, we were really talking about this intersection between public policy and business and organizational outcomes. There's an overlap that was happening. And so I think we were kind of one of the first firms that really understood that a little bit, and so we went out and started doing what we call public affairs work. Yeah. And I was here for about 9 years, and then I left to run a couple different companies. One of them was more political advertising, and then the other company I worked for was a data analytics company in the healthcare space. So, and after that, I was there for about 12 years, and I was kind of looking for another sort of career move, if you will. And one of the people in my network was Kathy Tunheim. And so I came to talk to her, and she said, hey, are you ever interested in coming back here? And so it was about 5.5 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's my tale.
Doesn't feel that long, but I believe it.
It's been a lot of change since I've gotten here, because we was here for about 1.5 years, maybe, and then COVID hit. And that fundamentally changed the nature of our business, as well as just the industry itself, if not writ large, the whole sort of business world. And it caused us to, and we're still sort of working through how to redefine ourselves and how to help our clients redefine themselves in this new marketplace. And I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit. That really involves making sure that they're understood by the stakeholders that are important to their success.
Yeah, I'd like to hear more about how you think COVID changed our industry.
Well, first and foremost, the tools have changed. Mm-hmm. I think in an instant, the digital world was coming up fairly fast, right? Some of our tools had changed already in terms of how we did our work. The internet and how we communicated with each other internally as well as our clients. And social media was kind of still a newer thing, and companies were trying to figure out how to use those platforms to their advantage. But as a world, we went instantaneously to almost entirely digital. Mm-hmm. And so the incentive to find new and different ways of communicating exploded. And so we were lucky because we, as an organization, always had built this company that we allowed a lot of flexibility in how we did our work. Mm-hmm. So our transition to a virtual world or virtual workplace wasn't as challenging, but for a lot of companies that weren't prepared for that, it was just very disruptive to the way they did business. And in our industry itself, some companies were prepared for that, some companies weren't. So I think we found ourselves having to, as a business, deal with the challenges that a lot of companies were having moving to that new sort of work environment, whether it be internally communicating with themselves, or how do they form new relationships with whoever their stakeholders are when you can't be in the same room with them.
Right.
And And so it just fundamentally kind of changed how we approached our business, how we interacted with clients, how we interacted with each other. And I think we're still adapting to it because now social media and all those digital platforms are dominant, right? And they were kind of growing before, but now they're really the way of the world. And the way in our industry, the way reporters work has changed dramatically. They're all virtual. Newsrooms have shut down because of the fact that all these digital platforms now are primary sources of information. So it's just different all along on many, many different levels.
I mean, 4 years ago this time, we're capturing this near the middle to end of February of 2024. The conversation is relevant anytime you listen to it, but 4 years ago this time, we worked every day in this office. You came in the morning and you left at the end of the day. And then suddenly, a couple weeks from now, 4 years ago, we were thrust to working from home. So while we were already very established in doing digital communications on behalf of clients who are communicating, we weren't a digital business at that time.
No.
And we were thrust into how do we work together in a virtual environment entirely. And now we're hybrid, but to that point, it changed the way we worked together. It changed the way we worked with clients, and just a fascinating thing, but also that we've retained aspects of that because they've been good for our workplace. And so
I think it was March 14th is when we went virtual.
Wow.
I remember a meeting the week before that we were all in sitting, and everybody couldn't really yet believe that this was a thing. So we were irritated that oh, this person can't come in because they were on vacation and we need to give them a period of time to make sure that they weren't sick. And, oh, we'll see you in a couple weeks. And then all of a sudden, we didn't see each other for a long time.
Well, the reason why I remember is 3 days before St. Patrick's Day. And so there you go, right?
All
Those are my moments in time.
Our celebrations are ruined.
Right? No, and
well, the bar shut down.
Yeah, so true. And I wasn't here then. I was just starting a new job at another TV station. So my first day at my new TV station was the first day of the governor's stay-at-home orders. And so being in a new newsroom where everyone was being sent home, it was crazy trying to learn, everything there. And
so did you guys all sort of instantaneously work remotely? I mean, how did that work inside of a newsroom?
No, so you needed
broadcast newsroom.
Yes, broadcast newsroom. So you needed to have a core group of people. I mean, you needed your directors, you needed a main assignment editor who was still working within the station. You needed a manager. There were a few positions where you couldn't work remotely, but any position where you could work remotely, I mean, they were all sent home. And since I was new, I was not sent home, which I was happy about, because producing a newscast from home, I did it for a month and begged to come back into the newsroom because I just didn't like it. Whereas some of my coworkers, they loved being able to produce a newscast from home. But it was really challenging. I mean, when you've got your anchors all in different spots remotely, you're changing the way you do interviews. I mean, Zoom interviews are now so common, but back then, back before then, if you had to do a Zoom interview, it was like, oh, the quality's terrible. This is horrible TV. And now, it just is what you see. So it was really interesting. I mean, you always needed a producer in the newsroom to booth a newscast, which is basically sitting in the control room, dealing with the director, dealing with everyone out who's live and on different locations, and dealing with whoever was in studio, because there would always be one anchor in studio too. Right. So you're the kind of coordinating all of that. And I mean, I remember sitting in the control room for, an hour and a half boothing newscast because so few people were allowed in the station and so few people, were able to do that. So it was.
In just as in addition to that, from an operational standpoint for companies, figuring all that technology out, but there was a whole sort of series of new rules and regulations that everybody had to follow. I mean, I think about our place, we had to put the 6-foot rule in, and everybody had to wear masks, and we loaded up on hand sanitizer, and we put restrictions on how many people could be in a room or not. I mean, there was so much fundamentally that was different about how you operated. And, back to communications, being able to communicate that effectively and efficiently to your workforce in particular, and or helping your clients do that was a really big challenge, almost at every level.
Yeah. Let's expand on that a little bit, because I think that in many ways still exists, even though we have gone back to a somewhat more, is there anything normal anymore?
Right.
Post and pre-COVID, all of those kinds of things. But communicating with audiences today is in some ways harder than ever, in other ways easier. There are way more channels. And so you can connect more one-on-one and directly. And this is something that we explore heavily here. Talk about what being understood means to you and how we are working to bring that to life with our team.
Yeah,
and clients.
I go back to how I first kind of became very apparent to me about how important it is for being understood. And it really is rooted in politics. I mean, I ran a lot of campaigns, and the structure of campaigns have changed now, and there's a lot more channels to be able to communicate. But at the end of the day, the essence of a political campaign for a candidate is really reaching your audience in a way that you're understood. And there's certain, ways to do it, things that are very important. In 1990, we really recognized very early that the way we were going to be most effective as a campaign is, one, to let Senator Wellstone be Senator Wellstone. But we decided to really play up his authenticity. And if people understood he was an authentic guy, some of his policy differences with the voters weren't as important, because they had a trust factor. They had a relationship with him that mattered a ton in terms of it. And that's very true today, as it was back in 1990, that the importance of sort of organizations and or companies to recognize that their success is really rooted in who their stakeholders are. And if you can't project or allow them to see you in a way that makes most sense for your business, and whether it be authenticity or you establish that relationship of trust, for instance, those are you're probably going to be more successful at the end of the day. So since that time in my work in politics, I've sort of believed that sort of credo about how important it is to be understood. It just so happened when I got and talked to Kathy, she sort of shared that whole sort of sentiment about the orientation of our work. And so it fit very nicely with what I kind of was doing in politics. I may not have recognized it necessarily as much as I was operating that way. Yeah, so so I'm a big believer and I think in this whole idea that there is it's almost an imperative, a critical imperative for organizations and companies to seek that understanding by your audiences, and you'll have a lot more success. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, if you're speaking to everybody, who are you speaking to? And there's still obviously great use for mass media. Coca-Cola, looking at Bess's Diet Coke, which is center stage, has to speak to a wide audience.
Right.
But if you're an issue-oriented person, finding your audience is an incredibly important
As we have seen, though, the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges, not the biggest, but one of the biggest challenges in that, because there's so many different platforms, so many different channels to be able to talk to your interested parties, your stakeholders, your audiences, and all that. What everybody is dealing with now is this unbelievable amount of disinformation that's out there that it can ruin your reputation. Mm-hmm. It can ruin people's perceptions of how you operate as a business or an organization, and sort of. So you not only have to be somewhat proactive in making sure your audience groups understand who you are, you have to also be prepared to be reactive in case there are bad players out there that really want to spread disinformation, false information, or go after you. We've all seen over the years that big brands have suffered serious consequences because some bad actors out there decided to make an issue that wasn't entirely true about them. And they've had to scramble to be able to react to that so they don't lose their customer base or their reputation or any of that. So it's really a very tricky game these days to be able to be on the offensive and not on the defensive.
Yeah, and a lot of that is because of social media. And so, I mean, anyone can get out there and say whatever they want. And so it is pretty challenging when we're working with clients and trying to help them defend their reputation when there is so much disinformation out there. So
it does beg the question, I think, about the responsibility of our social program, our social platforms and our digital platforms. Do they have a responsibility to screen out disinformation? And who makes that decision? I mean, this is the big issue that Facebook faced, right?
Yeah.
That everybody, and Zuckerberg and all the wizards at Facebook really wanted to say, hey, we're just a platform. We're just a conduit to information. And, First Amendment, free speech and all that. But they quickly found out that there were so many bad actors that they were dealing with. So then they started putting in sort of screeners and all that. And, the First Amendment people and the people that were the bad actors were very upset about it. It's like, hey, you can't, and who are you, Mark Zuckerberg, to be able to screen out what my First Amendment right is? And that continues today. I mean, everything, all the major platforms are dealing with this particular issue. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't necessarily want Mark Zuckerberg or his crew to be able to screen out what I want to say, or him to determine whether what I say is truthful or not. But I also think they have a responsibility at some level to be able to make that so that I'm not getting fed all kinds of lies. I think newsrooms in the traditional media, both in the print side, radio and or TV, they had sort of structure in place to be able to screen out, or at least they tell you they are telling you the truth. I mean, but there is a higher level of, I think, trust that you were getting at least accurate information at some level. Everybody argues about, the he said, she said stories about telling both sides. I mean, the old adage is that if you're a reporter and you're interviewing two people and it's pouring rain outside and you ask one guy, hey, what's the weather out? And the first guy says, hey, it's raining. But you ask the second guy and he says, well, it's sunny out. What is a reporter? Are they to report, well, one guy says it's raining, the other guy says it's sunny, or is it your responsibility to walk outside and say, you know what, it's raining?
Yeah.
And we're kind of at that point now as to how to, who's the truth teller and who do we believe?
Well, we're at a point where now people are self-deciding who to believe.
Yes.
And we've seen that, given your background in politics, we've seen that come through globally, policy and orientation around who's in leadership, where do people get their information. It's so distributed by personal decision making now, and I think COVID really pushed that even further. But now introduction of AI, which I know that you're particularly interested in as well, where do we go from here to get back to, we'll never have the nightly news being that's where you get your information, or the newspaper in the morning, that's the arbiter of truth telling now. But how do we get back to a place where there is some agreement around facts, even if I perceive it differently than someone else?
Or can we even?
Can we? Yeah.
Well, I think that's the big question, Bess, as to whether we can. And therefore, I think the fallback is for companies, for people, for businesses and all that, to establish that relationship with their stakeholders, to build up that trust that people do then start looking at organizations with maybe a different lens because they feel confident they're getting the right information. And, I don't know if we can, I certainly would never suggest that we have some sort of mind control over people. So you're never really going to be able to do that. But it is a challenge about how to sort of weed out what's truth and what's not truth. And particularly, I mean, the way it's playing out in politics, I think we can all see it. And I'm not going to get over political here, but I think we have two sides have clearly sort of emerged here in terms of what's truthful and what's not truthful. And I think one party has decided that anything goes. Truth is what I say it is. And there's a lot of people that believe that because of the fact that they trust the person that's saying it to be telling them the truth. And so you got to counterbalance that with someone else that establishes a relationship with his supporters, that they're telling the truth. And so we got this battle almost about who do you believe and what do you want to believe? And it's a challenge then for people like us who work in this area all the time to make sure we're establishing those relationships with their customers or clients or stakeholders to be able to drive up that degree of trust in what you're saying is true.
Yeah. I know we talk often here too on those ethical lines of making sure that we go over and above to ensure that we're helping our clients find those lines. How are you being truthful? We have clients who are always truthful, of course, but how to push clients to be authentic. What messages need to be shared? How often do you need to share these messages for the right people to hear them? Where do they need to be shared in order to be heard? And trying to continually push that line in order to help our clients be successful. How important do you see for our team that continued push of assessing this microcosm of ethics of what is truth and working with organizations who want to be understood, and how we continue to push that needle on, are they being understood by the right audiences?
Yeah, I think, I'm proud to say, I think our default is always on truth, right?
Yeah.
And we would never suggest to a client that they do or they project a message that is untruthful or anything like that. But it is I think also that one of the things I think is very unique about what we do, and other people do this, but I think we've kind of really built it into our sort of DNA here, is I think we take a decidedly strategic approach to communications. And I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of talk about that, but we do have a methodology about how we approach that. And it's always rooted in truth, and it's rooted in making sure whatever is our advice is based upon whatever their business objective is, whatever their business, and so being strategic in how you deliver those messages in a credible way is critically important, right? And you can do it in a variety of different ways. You can say, well, the CEO is a very credible person, so they're the ones that really should be delivering this message. But maybe not. Maybe the CEO is not necessarily great on camera or doesn't project that. Maybe you find a different vehicle. I mean, I think some of the big brands struggle with how do they create that level of that personal connection, that personal relationship, with that credibility in what they're selling and all that. When you're kind of a faceless sort of, in the case of Target, you're a bullseye or a dog,
right,
whatever they're, and so
maybe different messenger to different audiences.
Different messages.
Right.
Sometimes
that's where I was
the
going.
CEO is.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I think that's entirely right. So you have to be strategic about what is the most effective way of distributing, of getting your message out. And in a way that's going to measure your effectiveness with that engine. Let me jump back though, because you brought up AI, and I think AI is a game changer for our industry and for businesses. Yeah. And the way AI operates really in a very simple way is that it sort of gathers up what's out in the internet on the public sphere or out there in the universe somewhere, and goes through an algorithm of identifying what, in response to the query, thank you, that's a hard word, query, to be able to sort of put some sort of logic together and give you back a response. So I look at AI as it is right now, artificial intelligence, is only as good as the information that's out there. Right? So can you manipulate that information that's out there by being very proactive and making sure you're getting your messages out across whatever social platforms? That's one way of doing it. The other way is really looking at it, AI as an analytical tool to go out there and scrape the internet, and you can understand sentiment, you can understand perception, you can understand about a lot of different subjects, and you can break it down, and then you can sort of devise what it is that you need to say, either work towards correcting a misperception or being proactive and saying, hey, this audience group is really they have great sentiment towards this kind of approach, and then you sort of design your messages around it. So I think it's a game changer in terms of our business, but I think it cuts across all businesses in terms of how it's being used. And it's not only in the communications field. I tell this story often, but I was always struck by the fact that in the company I was working for before I came back to Tunheim was a data analytics company. And we dealt with on the revenue cycle side of things. So I had to spend a lot of time with the data folks inside of hospitals. And one of the things that they were really pushing at this time, God, this was only 6 or 7 years ago, so it's relatively new, but using AI as a diagnostic tool. And now it's pretty common, but at that time, one of the hospitals I was working with, they had a system inside of an emergency room, right? And the doctor in the emergency room would type in symptoms. Here's what this patient is presenting on symptomology, right? And AI would do its work in taking all the information it had in the medical field, research and all that kind of stuff, and they found that the result would be a diagnosis that was 99% accurate.
Wow.
So it really eliminated, right?
Yeah.
Doctors, the error on the side of doctors for misdiagnosis. Well, if I'm in a hospital, of course I'm going to do that, right? Because it drives down my liability, all those kinds of things. I think there's a chance for us to figure out how to do that in business as well, or companies, or whoever needs to sort of be accurate in what they're saying. You can use AI to your benefit that way.
Yeah, I mean, to build off of that, I still want a doctor interpreting that, as opposed to that old adage that doctors say, don't Google your symptoms, because that's not where you want to go. Right. You will think you have something terminal immediately. But if a doctor is interpreting those, and it just helps a doctor get to the right answer faster, there's less guesstimating, or focus on one symptom as opposed to the collective whole, or whatever those things are, because they're still interpreting based on experience and expertise and time. in the same way, how can we all be empowered by AI in such a way that we trust the data and the information behind it, but also can do jobs faster or use our expertise and creativity on top of that in order to do it better and more expediently?
I think AI also is a great opportunity for us as a company, and we're leaning into it to figure out how we can use it to help our clients and all that. And we've got some really great tools that we're using to be able to do that. But it's such a new thing that, almost to our advantage, nobody really understands it, or what it means. And frankly, most of the sort of internet wizards still don't understand how the black box works, because every algorithm is different depending on which platform, ChatGPT or Sora, whatever the new product. And no one really understands how it works because it's all sort of specially designed based upon the algorithm that they develop. So for our business, it is an opportunity for us to go in and help people navigate what's to come and how they may use it to their advantage. I think we're finding the starting point really is on the analytics side. Let's understand a lot more about who your stakeholders are and what they're thinking and all that to improve your ability to communicate with them in the way that makes most sense.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of positive aspects of it, but with anything, there's going to be the negatives. What do you see as parts of AI that could have a negative impact on our industry and the work that we do?
Well, I think some of the more common threats are that people will use AI to do their work. For instance, what we do a lot of writing, whether it be a press release or a statement or you name it, strategy memo about a certain kind of issue. It's really easy now to, I'll use ChatGPT as an example, to put in a query into ChatGPT and, hey, write me a statement that having to deal with X particular issue that I'm facing, and boom, within seconds you come up with a statement. And, I'm sure a lot of folks internally in organizations, okay, I can do this. I don't need my PR agency. I don't need my communications partner to be able to do that. So I think there's certainly a risk to our business like that.
Right.
But and I think that all needs to play out as well. And a lot of companies and organizations are having to put into place some guidelines. Here's can you use AI for this or that? Because I think to your point, there is a little bit of an ethical issue in terms of folks and how they do their job.
If you use that AI written press release, does it actually capture the information that well? I think we've all gone to webinars seeing the risk of too much reliance on AI too. And so have you thought about, does it even correlate to what that audience needs to hear, and those kinds of things that can come in it too? The
other threat, I think, Bess, to your point, is not only on that side, but I think more and more organizations are probably going to invest in the analytics side of using AI as a tool for them to better understand. Good, bad, or otherwise, some of these tools aren't that complicated to use. And so, you could really, as someone that's an internal inside of a corporation, you could build a dashboard that gets at some of the information that you're seeking pretty easily. But I think that's a little slower in coming, and I see that as an opportunity for us to sort of step in but the downside of it, and some of the thing that I think we bring to the table a lot is years and years of experience on the strategic side.
Right.
How to take that information and use it to your advantage, and that's value. We can put together content for you that is consistent with what you're reading in your data to be able to effectively communicate. And I think that's the door that we got to walk through.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about social media and how it's kind of changed the game. We've talked about AI. What else has been a big game changer during your career as far as helping audiences being understood and just communicating with your main stakeholders?
Wow, good question. What else? I do go back to this. I think the biggest threat, and we've touched on it before, is this idea of misinformation. It is, it's like, the big bad wolf that sits in the forest waiting for it to emerge in a variety of different ways. And I think that's really true. I think we as a human species have to kind of deal with this issue about we got to live in a sort of some semblance of truth. We've got to have truth to our lives, and how to do that when truth now is what you think it is, and to me that's the biggest threat I think we have, and we're going to have to continue to deal with, because there are people that have learned, and I don't mean it's a select few. I think there's a lot of people that learned that they can use it to their advantage. And so there's no incentive to sort of change back to sort of a fact is a fact. Mm-hmm. Fact is whatever I want it to be and whatever I tell you it is. And tough beans, it's sort of that attitude people have. And that will be, I think, the downfall. Yeah. If we as I'm talking, really big here, but if the human species fail, it's because of things like that we can't agree on some sort of truth.
Right.
And trusting each other.
Yeah.
Somewhere in this, probably especially as we were ripped apart during COVID, people have stopped trusting each other. And so that's undermined the ability to even have a conversation about where are you coming from? Where am I coming from? We can have a debate and still love each other. And I think we're coming back from that. I think there are a lot of people who have self-recognized some of that and are working through that. But any ideas that you have from your career about how to connect with people in a way that is about moving forward rather than continuing this antitrust?
Yeah, I don't know if I have any secret recipe, but I am still a big believer that we all have an innate nature of forming relationships. And I do think there is the power of connectivity that is not aided by this virtual world we operate in. I think it hasn't served us well. I understand that it's the way of the future, and it's actually probably a more efficient way in certain respects of how to do business. But I do think that we lose something as human beings by always communicating with us at a distance, because there's a natural wall that's put up in front of you when you only have sort of a digital-based relationship. There's a way you can just sort of walk away from truth or walk away from it. And I think that is the greatest. I always come back to, interestingly enough, something I read in the New Yorker years and years ago. This is right when the internet was just coming to onto the scene, and email was a thing, right? Now, this is going back a little ways. Mm-hmm. But the article was written by a guy that was going to interview Bill Gates about email and Microsoft and its new suite products and all that. And he was from the New Yorker, so he was in New York, and he was going to fly out to Seattle, right, to Microsoft headquarters and talk to him about this new thing called email, internet-based email. And for whatever reason, his plane got delayed in New York, coming out of New York. And so he called up Bill Gates and said, hey, I'm going to miss my flight. I'm not going to be able to get there. I'm sorry. I know we had this date. He said, could we conduct this interview over email since we're here? Yeah. Gates said, yeah, sure. So they did. And in this article, they had the transcript of that conversation that went back and forth. And one thing that Bill Gates said that I always remember is, even though email and this internet way of communicating with each other is great and it's going to be a game changer and all that kind of stuff, there is the danger here, and even he thought of it, that we lose this personal connection with people and the ability to have a conversation one-on-one, because there's so much that goes on between us sitting here having this conversation and the sort of the interaction we have at a very human level that you lose.
Yeah.
And it is going to be one of the most disruptive things to human existence. It's a big word, but big concept, but it's true.
But I think we see that.
And I think it's playing out all right now in a very big way with all of this digitizing of the way we communicate and the way we relate to each other.
And I think it's interesting because, I mean, we've obviously been through the other way of communicating where everything was in person, but then you look at the younger generations with, I mean, that's all they're growing up with is communicating digitally.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Well, I know John to be a highly empathetic leader and big believer in servant leadership. And so if anybody can come up with ways to communicate that are about connectivity, I know that you will lead with your heart, and that is
I appreciate
what we got to
that.
try.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it is going to be, whether it's servant leadership or other kinds of leadership that is empathy-based, or I do think we have to have an expectation that our leaders, both at, in our government, in our business community, our nonprofit community, or wherever it is, to really lead the way. And if, I think all of us at some level have experienced disappointment in the way our leaders have reacted and acted, and reacted. And I think we're starved for that kind of leadership
Yeah. But if we can take something away from this, I think authenticity and being willing to speak to what we know today, and sometimes having to go back and say, I learned something and I'd do it differently today, but we took an act, a leap of faith or whatever led to those decisions. Just help people understand it. Open the door in authentic communications, because ultimately at the end of the day, trust is built through those kinds of articulations, and letting people be part of that process helps them make their own decisions.
Yep. I agree.
Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Hopefully I can get invited back.
Oh, you'll be invited back. Don't worry.
Because I'm never short of something to say.
We like that.
Thank you.
We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.